What if I told you that deep beneath the Swiss Alps, there exists a village that hasn't seen sunlight for over 400 years? A place where children are born with eyes like mercury, where the houses burrow into the earth like wounds, and where the very mention of the sun is considered blasphemy. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is the true story of Solweiler, the village that chose darkness over light, and paid the ultimate price. My name is Alex, and today we're diving into one of the most disturbing and forgotten chapters in European history. But before we begin, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear will change how you see the world above ground. The story of Solweiler isn't just about a hidden village. It's about what happens when humanity turns its back on nature itself. Hit that notification bell, because once you hear this story, you'll never look at a basement the same way again. Our story begins in 1597, in what is now the remote Bernese Oberland region of Switzerland. Picture this. Winter has lasted 18 months. The crops have failed 3 years running. The Black Death, though waning, still stalks the mountain villages like a hungry wolf. And in the small farming community of Solweiler, something unthinkable is about to happen. The village priest, Father Heinrich Dunkler, makes an announcement that will echo through centuries. Standing before his starving congregation, this man who had supposedly devoted his life to God's light, declares that the sun is not divine illumination, but rather Satan's eye watching over the earth. He claims to have received a vision that only by hiding from the sun's gaze can the people of Solweiler find salvation. Now, you might think the villagers would reject such madness. But remember, these are people who have watched their children starve, who have buried more neighbors than they can count. When you're desperate enough, even the most insane proposition can sound like hope. Father Dunkler's solution is as brilliant as it is horrifying. If the sun is evil, then they must go where its light cannot reach. The villagers begin digging. Not just cellars or root cellars, but entire underground homes. They excavate beneath their existing houses, creating a mirror world in the earth. Below. The work takes 3 years. 3 years of tunneling through rock and soil, of creating underground chambers, of building a world that the sun will never touch. And incredibly, the plan seems to work. The plague passes over Solweiler entirely. The crops, what few they manage to grow in covered greenhouse structures, flourish in the filtered light. The villagers begin to believe that Father Dunkler was right. By 1601, every single resident of Solweiler lives completely underground. They've created streets of tunnels, underground workshops, even a subterranean church. The only structures above ground are carefully disguised: ventilation shafts and the greenhouse domes where they grow their food. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Within 5 years of moving underground, the children born in Solweiler begin to show changes. Their eyes, denied natural sunlight, develop an unusual coloration, a pale silvery hue that seems to reflect light rather than absorb it. Their skin becomes almost translucent. Their hair grows in strange patterns. The villagers see these changes not as deformities, but as blessings, proof that they are becoming purified, separated from the corrupted surface world. Father Dunkler encourages these beliefs. He preaches that the children are evolving into a higher form of human, one untainted by the sun's evil influence. He calls them Dämonkinder, the moon children. And incredibly, the villagers embrace this interpretation. They begin to see their physical changes as marks of divine favor. The isolation affects more than just their appearance. Cut off from the outside world, the villagers develop their own customs, their own interpretation of Christianity, their own very disturbed social structure. Marriage begins to occur exclusively within families, as they believe that mixing their purified blood with outsiders would contaminate their holy evolution. By 1650, what we see in Solweiler is no longer recognizable as a normal human community. The inhabitants have developed their own language, a twisted dialect of German mixed with their own invented words. They've created their own calendar, based not on the sun's movement, but on the phases of the moon that they can still observe through their few surface openings. The most disturbing aspect of their society is what they call Die Reinigung, The purification. Children who don't develop the characteristic silver eyes are considered failures, still tainted by the surface world. These children, well, let me just say that the baptismal font in their underground church served purposes that would make your stomach turn. Now, you might wonder how we know all this. How can we have such detailed knowledge of a village that supposedly cut itself off from the world? The answer lies in the journal of Brother Marcus Waldman, a traveling monk who stumbled upon Solweiler in 1660-8. Brother Marcus was seeking shelter during a particularly violent snowstorm when he noticed strange geometric patterns in what appeared to be an abandoned field. Following these patterns, he discovered the hidden ventilation shafts and, through them, the world beneath. What he found below ground defied everything he thought he knew about humanity. His journal, discovered in a monastery in Bern only 30 years ago, describes a society that had become utterly alien. The villagers, now in their third generation, underground, had developed rituals and beliefs that were part Christian, part pagan, and entirely twisted. They worshipped not God, but what they called Der Schatten, the shadow which they believed was the true divine presence. Hidden beneath the earth, Brother Marcus describes children with eyes like mirrors of the moon, adults whose skin had become so pale it was nearly transparent, and religious ceremonies that involved, well, the details are too disturbing to share in full, but they involved blood. They involved the consumption of substances that should never be consumed, and they involved practices that the Catholic Church would consider the worst forms of heresy. The monk tried to convince the villagers to return to the surface, to rejoin the world of the living. But by this time, the surface world had become literally painful to them. Their eyes, adapted to near-total darkness, couldn't tolerate even candlelight without causing agony. Their skin, deprived of sunlight for generations, would blister and burn at the slightest exposure to natural light. They were trapped in their own creation. Brother Marcus stayed with them for 6 months, documenting their society, their beliefs, their daily life. His journal reveals a community that had achieved something that no society before or since has managed. They had completely separated themselves from the natural world. But that separation had cost them their humanity. The children born in those tunnels weren't just physically different, they were mentally different too. They showed no curiosity about the surface world, no desire for sunlight, no connection to nature. They were, in every meaningful sense, a different species. Brother Marcus wrote that looking into their silver eyes was like looking into the eyes of something that had never been fully alive. When Brother Marcus finally left Solweiler, he took with him detailed maps of the tunnel system, sketches of the inhabitants, and a promise from Father Dunkler's successor, a man whose name translates roughly to Brother Darkness, that they would never return to the surface world, and they kept that promise. For the next 200 years, Solweiler existed in complete isolation. Occasionally, travelers would report strange lights moving beneath the ground in that region, or odd sounds echoing from beneath their feet. But no one investigated. The area developed a reputation for being cursed, and local guides would refuse to take travelers through that particular valley. It wasn't until 1873 that the outside world intruded on Solweiler again. A team of Swiss geologists, mapping underground water systems, broke through into one of the village tunnels. What they found was a civilization that had continued to evolve in the darkness. The village had grown. The original 47 inhabitants had become nearly 200, spread through an underground complex that covered almost 3 square miles. But the growth had come at a terrible price. The intermarrying, the isolation, the complete separation from natural light had created a population that was barely recognizable as human. The geologists report. Buried in Swiss government archives, and only recently declassified, describes people whose limbs had grown, elongated and thin, whose fingers had become grotesquely extended, whose faces had taken on an almost insectoid appearance. The silver eyes, once just an unusual coloration, had become larger, more prominent, taking up nearly half of each face. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't their physical appearance, it was their behavior. The Solweiler inhabitants no longer spoke any. recognizable language. They communicated through a series of clicks, whispers, and gestures that seemed more suited to creatures that had never known speech. They had developed a society based entirely on hierarchy determined by how far one's family line could be traced back to the original 47 settlers. The geologists tried to communicate with them, tried to convince them to come to the surface, but the inhabitants fled deeper into their tunnels at the first sight of the explorers' lanterns. Later expeditions found that the tunnels had been collapsed, the entrances sealed from within. Solweiler had chosen, once again, to hide from the light. The story should end there. A lost civilization, cut off by their own choice, disappearing into the depths of the earth. But it doesn't end there, because in 1956, something happened that brought Solweiler back into contact with the surface world. Whether they wanted it or not, the Swiss government, expanding their network of emergency bunkers during the rising tensions in Europe, began excavating large underground facilities in the Bernese Oberland. One of these excavation sites was directly above the old Solweiler Valley. The construction crews, using dynamite to clear rock, accidentally broke through into the deepest levels of the village tunnels. What they found was a tomb. The entire underground complex was filled with bodies, hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns throughout the tunnels and chambers. But these weren't the remains of people who had died recently. Carbon dating later revealed that the bodies were at least 50 years old, yet they showed no signs of decomposition. They had been preserved by the unique conditions in the tunnels, the constant temperature, the lack of bacteria, the absence of light. Every single inhabitant of Solweiler had died at approximately the same time, in what appeared to be a mass suicide ritual. But the strangest part was their positioning. They weren't lying down as if they had taken poison or hanged themselves. They were arranged in complex geometric patterns, their arms and legs positioned to create symbols and shapes. That defied easy interpretation. The investigation that followed revealed the final chapter of Solweiler's story. Based on journals found in the underground chambers, we now know that by the 1880s, the village had developed a belief that they had become something beyond human. They called themselves Die Perfekten, the perfect ones, and believed that their physical transformation was preparing them for a final evolution. The journals, written in that strange dialect that had developed over centuries of isolation, described visions and prophecies about a coming transformation. They believed that on a specific date, calculated according to their lunar calendar, they would shed their physical bodies and become pure beings of shadow and darkness. That date, according to their calculations, fell on October 3, 1880-7. On that night, every man, woman, and child in Solweiler participated in what they called Die letzte Reinigung, the final purification. They arranged themselves in the patterns found by the construction crews, patterns that supposedly would help them transcend physical existence. And then they died, all of them, simultaneously. The Swiss government classified the entire discovery. The bodies were quietly removed and cremated. The tunnels were filled with concrete, and the area was declared off-limits for mining or construction. Official records list the cause of death as mass carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty ventilation. But the construction workers who found the bodies tell a different story. They say that when they first broke through into the tunnels, they could hear sounds. Not human sounds, but something else. Something that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the very stones were whispering. They say that some of the bodies appeared to move when the lights first hit them, as if they were trying to crawl back into the deeper darkness. Most disturbing of all, they say that when the bodies were finally removed, they found something else in the deepest chamber of the complex. Carved into the walls were thousands of symbols, arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to move when looked at directly. At the center of this chamber was a single phrase, carved in letters 3 feet tall. Das licht word, uns nie wieder finden, the light will never find us again. Today, the location where Solweiler once existed is marked only by a small memorial stone, placed there by the Swiss government in 1990. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of those who chose darkness, There are no names, no dates, no explanation of what happened there. But local guides in the area tell stories. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, you can still hear sounds coming from beneath the ground in that valley. Sounds like whispers, like footsteps, like something moving through tunnels that are supposed to be filled with concrete. They say that sometimes, hikers camping in the area wake up to find strange geometric patterns drawn in the dirt around their tents. Patterns that match the symbols found carved in the walls of Solweiler's deepest chambers. And they say that, if you look carefully at the memorial stone on nights when the moon is completely dark, you can see something that shouldn't be there. A faint, silvery glow, like moonlight reflecting off metal. But there is no metal in the stone. There is no moon to cast light. There is only the memorial, and the darkness beneath it, and the whispered stories of a village that tried to hide from the sun and found something much worse in the shadows they embraced. The story of Sol raises questions that we may never be able to answer. What happens to humanity when it completely cuts itself off from the natural world? Is it possible for people to evolve so far from their origins that they become something else entirely? And most disturbing of all, what if they succeeded? What if the inhabitants of Solweiler didn't die on that October night in 1887, but simply transformed into something that doesn't need physical bodies to exist? The Swiss government maintains that the tunnels were completely filled and sealed, but construction crews working in the area still occasionally report breaking through into empty spaces that shouldn't exist. Spaces that smell of earth and age and something else. Something like the smell of very old fear. So the next time you're walking through a forest on a moonless night, and you hear sounds coming from beneath your feet, remember Solweiler. Remember the village that hid from the sun and found that some forms of darkness are hungry for more than just light. They hunger for souls, and if you ever find yourself in the Swiss Alps, in a valley where the shadows seem deeper than they should be, and you see geometric patterns in the soil that look like they were made by something with too many fingers, well, maybe it's time to head back toward the light. Because some places in this world were meant to stay hidden, and some stories were meant to remain in the dark dot. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves in the spaces where the light never goes. If this story kept you up at night, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories that the world tried to bury. And whatever you do, don't go looking for that memorial stone. Some curiosities aren't worth satisfying. Sleep well, if you can.